Meantime, thank you all so much for joining. I'm with Beth Shelburne, and I'll introduce her in a few moments just as we wait for some more people. Oh, great, Isaac. Thank you so much. So Isaac got a notification, so that's great. And hopefully more and more people will get a notification. I guess in the meantime, I'll just introduce Beth Shelburne, who is an incredible journalist, someone I very much admire. She's a journalist of 25 years. She's one of the leading voices in criminal justice reform and prison reform in the state of Alabama and also nationwide often. She co-produced the Oscar-nominated documentary, The Alabama Solution, which is one of the most incredible documentaries of the year, I reckon. And, she has made an amazing long-form narrative podcast about the case that we're going to be speaking about, Toforest Johnson's out of Alabama. So, we don't have so much time to talk here. So if you're interested in his case or criminal justice in general, I highly, highly recommend going over to Apple Podcasts. It's called Ear Witness, named after one of the things that we'll be talking about today. And it's absolutely incredible. Beth spoke to some of the most important people in the case, managed to get the head investigator in the case that, played a massive role in getting Toforest convicted. So it's a really incredible podcast, and I highly recommend it. So, this is Beth Shelburne, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction, Gabby.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Well deserved. So now on to Toforest's case, who we're going to be speaking about today. So Toforest Johnson has been on death row now for 26 years in Alabama. He has always maintained his innocence from the beginning. And the really surprising thing about Toforest's case is not just the holes in his case and the holes in his conviction, but also just how much support he's garnered from the most unexpected people, including staunch death penalty supporter and former Alabama Attorney General Bill Baxley, sitting District Attorney Danny Carr for Jefferson County, and two jurors from the original trial that were, played a part in his conviction all those years ago. Even they have come forward now saying they don't believe Toforest is guilty. I guess if you can just contextualize that for us, Beth, how surprising is that those people in particular have come forward to support Toforest in his, pursuit for proving his innocence?
Well, there's actually three jurors. The third juror has not wanted to speak publicly, like be recorded. But I did file an original story with WBRC on the jurors coming forward and interviewed that third juror. So I think if you look at the facts of his case, it isn't really surprising because the case, there's literally no credible evidence that supports that Toforest had anything to do with this murder or was even on the side of town where it happened. But what makes the support from some of those people that you mentioned extraordinary is that they are prosecutors. And anybody that studies the death penalty knows that prosecutors and police are very reluctant, most of them anyway, very reluctant to take a look back at a criminal conviction, particularly a capital murder case involving the death of a law enforcement officer. And we have not one, but two, but three career prosecutors that are publicly supporting a new trial in Toforest's case. The most extraordinary one being the very prosecutor who sent him to death row, who asked the jury for a death sentence in the case, and who tried Toforest twice. The first time the case, the jury couldn't reach a verdict, and it was a hung jury, and the judge declared a mistrial. But to have him call for a new trial, to have the current elected district attorney use his conviction integrity unit to examine this case and to come to the same conclusion, to call for a new trial, and then a retired attorney general who, as you said, has been a lifelong supporter of the death penalty, Bill Baxley, who had no real, purpose to read the case file other than being bored. And his son asked him to look at it, and he was just absolutely gobsmacked at how ridiculous the case is against Toforest, and has been a leading voice in not only calling for a new trial, but saying he believes Toforest is innocent.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. So many things have to line up for these kind of people to come forwards because, they have to almost throw their colleagues somewhat under the bus to say they got it wrong. So it just, yeah.
Yeah, they're breaking rank in a way. There's not really space for prosecutors or other system actors to call a conviction into question. And, just to put it into context, how extraordinary it is that Jeff Wallace, the original prosecutor, supports a new trial. We called innocence projects around the country, and we could not find another capital murder case in any jurisdiction anywhere where the original prosecutor is supporting a new trial. That just doesn't happen.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's what makes this case so interesting to me is just how many supporters he has and from unlikely places. And I guess on that note, a lot of people, unless they work in this on this topic a lot or read a ton about this topic, might be inclined to believe that the system, we should trust it to get it right. How do we know that it is right to question these convictions, especially in places like Alabama? Do we know that it happens that people are convicted when they haven't committed the crime?
Oh, yeah. We know it happens for sure. It happens in Alabama and it happens everywhere. But to me, having studied our criminal justice system since 2012, it seems to be more of a feature rather than a bug. In Alabama, we've had some of the most high-profile death row exonerations in the country. In 2015, Anthony Ray Hinton was released from Alabama's death row after 30 years. And the state still refuses to say that he is legally innocent, even though there's literally no evidence connecting him to the murder. There's many other lower profile cases that I've come into contact with that aren't people on death row and really aren't cases that have gotten much attention at all, where people are convicted on a single witness who's been paid a reward or, debunked science. There's a man named Charles McCrory who has been in Alabama's custody for 40 years for the murder of his wife based on junk science bite marks that even the expert who testified in his trial has said is completely meaningless, and he takes it all back. And yet the state is still fighting to keep Mr. McCrory in prison, and he was recently denied parole. So I think that, even in cases where people will say the system is working as it should, like when people are exonerated or are granted clemency. In the rare case, Governor Ivey has granted clemency twice recently, which was surprising. In the case of Rocky Myers, her reasoning for granting clemency was that he has a very strong innocence claim. But the clemency only remanded Rocky Myers to prison for the rest of his natural life. So while he's no longer on death row, where he was for 30 years at risk of execution, he's still in our prison system and will likely die there unless his attorneys can convince a court to overturn his conviction. So I think that all of those things together should cause us to continue to question the system, because even when it supposedly works in the defendant's favor, it's working really slowly, far too slowly for people to lose decades of their life.
Yeah, I can't imagine the feeling of sitting on death row or even in prison knowing that I didn't do what they said that I did. It's just simply torture. And, thank you for setting up that context that, we should constantly be questioning these convictions because oftentimes the system gets it wrong. And, we'll talk about the context in which Toforest was wrongfully convicted and the rush to judgment that there was there. But I guess for anybody who doesn't know Toforest's case, can you just sort of lay out the basic facts of his case for us?
Sure. It is a pretty complicated investigation and set of trials, which is part of the reason that I did an 8-part podcast series to really slow down and unpack all that, because I think it's important for us to understand how a wrongful conviction like this happens. And it often happens that way over a long period of time, where we sort of lose sight of the reality, and we get caught up in a story. But it started in 1995 when a beloved sheriff's deputy was shot and killed while moonlighting as a security guard at a local hotel. And there were no eyewitnesses to the crime and very few ear witnesses that heard the gunshots. They were guests in the hotel that were asleep when it happened, because it was just before 1 a.m. So it was a whodunit from the very beginning, and there was no clear motive. There was just no real story that emerged on why somebody would kill this man or what had happened, because he was working as a security guard, but he did something kind of puzzling before he was killed, which didn't line up with how he performed that job. He typically did rounds around the hotel in his squad car a couple times a night. And then he would walk the interior of the hotel. And whether he was outside or inside the hotel, he always had his two-way radio with him, which he used to communicate with the front desk clerk.
Mhm.
And for some reason, he left his two-way radio and his cigarette that he was smoking on the table that he was sitting at in the atrium of the hotel, and walked out some back doors that were rarely used into a back parking lot. And he was subsequently shot twice at close range. So that's always been very unusual circumstances. The prosecutors claimed that it seemed like he heard something and went out the back door to investigate, but that doesn't really resolve the question of why did he leave his two-way radio. Other
Right.
people said it kind of seems like he was going out there to meet someone, maybe somebody was dropping something off, or I don't know, but that he was expecting to see someone and that person ended up killing them. So, but it's a mystery because we just don't know, and we will never know.
Right.
Police were really desperate to catch someone, and they were kind of running on empty for the first couple of weeks. A reward was offered, and then a 15-year-old informant came forward with information that led to the arrest of Toforest and 5 other people. Her story changed over and over and over again under police pressure, but ultimately Toforest and one other man were both charged. They were each tried twice,
Mm.
not based on information from the 15-year-old, because by the time the trials rolled around, she had really fallen apart as a witness and just no longer reliable for the
Yeah.
state to use. And so they found another witness who is the ear witness in the case, and she is the entire case against Toforest. She didn't see the murder. She wasn't there when it happened. She doesn't know Toforest. She had never met him. But what she offered is a story.
Mm.
And the story is that she eavesdropped on a phone call that she claims involved Toforest talking about the murder. And there's no recording of that call. We just have to go on her credibility, which, if you've listened to Ear Witness, falls apart in the
Yeah.
podcast series. So that's the facts of the case. And it really shatters the myth that people are getting sent to death row on airtight evidence.
Right.
There is no direct evidence connecting Toforest to the murder. There was no murder weapon recovered. There's no forensic evidence at all connecting him to this crime. They never found anything, not a hair, not a fiber, not a drop of blood, nothing.
Mm.
And he has a airtight alibi backed up by at least 10 witnesses that he was not there, that he was, in fact, somewhere else, a very specific place across town in that time frame when the crime happened. And these alibi witnesses have just not been believed. jury,
Yeah.
by police. And so it is a case that kind of calls into question what biases we bring into our
Mm.
understanding of crimes and court cases, the presumption of guilt,
Yeah.
and who is believed and who is not believed and why.
Yeah. No, the holes that you highlight in the podcast are so interesting, and I love the fact that you started the podcast by explaining that you're not trying to figure out who killed the deputy, but rather everything points to the fact that it just was not Toforest. It's,
Mhm.
it would be up to the police to figure out who actually did it. But I guess if we can backtrack a little bit, what the circumstances of a deputy being killed and this kind of time in Alabama where
Mhm.
there's this rush to judgment, there's pressure on the police department to figure out who's done it. Can you explain a little bit about how that might lead to a wrongful conviction?
Oh my gosh, there was so much pressure on these deputies. And by the way, they were the victim's colleague. And so that in itself is unusual when a police officer is killed in the line of duty. Departments often ask another agency to
Mm,
be the prevailing investigative agency simply because of emotions, grief. There's all kinds of things happening when you lose someone that way that could inhibit or skew the investigation. This was also the mid 1990s, the middle of the crack epidemic, the golden age of mass incarceration, where we were like sending so many people away and filling up jails and prisons across the country. It was the age of the super predator, where young Black men were looked at particularly harshly. At that time, they still are, but I think that was really just unprecedented. And so you have these deputies that were colleagues with the victim. They have no evidence to go on. They are scrambling. And yet the sheriff and everybody in the chain of command is telling them, you got to find someone. You got to solve this case. And the investigator, 30 years after the fact, was honest about that and told me that he felt that pressure. And that he was angry as he was conducting this investigation. When you have a really strong prevailing emotion, none of us are quite our best selves, in that mindset. And so I think, there was a lot of risk there for them to feel compelled to just bring in anybody and everybody in
right.
order to get somebody. And that's what they did.
Yeah. It just seems like even something he said to you during that you provided during the podcast in your interview with him was, I know going in what happened. He sort of explains that like he comes into it with a conclusion already and then basically looks for anything to point in the right direction. And I know you've touched on some of the things that are massive red flags into Forrest's case, and there are so many holes in his conviction and so many issues with his case. And again, if anybody wants a more detailed account of those issues, Ear Witness is an incredible podcast. It's not boring, which I really loved. It's narrative, and because sometimes these accounts of investigations and stuff can kind of drag, but the way you did it was so brilliant.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, please do go listen to that series because we're just going to touch on a few of the holes and issues with his case. But I guess the first, starting from the very beginning, a couple of people actually heard the shots being fired in the hotel where the deputy was shot. And am I correct in thinking their descriptions of A, the car, and B, the shooter don't match to Forrest?
Absolutely, you're correct. And that's the beauty in going back and doing, I think, a really thorough audit. As an outsider, I wasn't involved in any of this, but I was able to get my hands on the entire investigative file and also pulled every single news story that's ever been written about this case. And so my producer and I went back to the very beginning and, constructed our own timeline based on the record that was entered in, that the media reported, and also the record that we had in the investigative file. And there were, I believe, 4 or 5 people in the hotel that heard the gunshots and actually looked out the window and saw something in the back parking lot. But there were 2 men in particular who described a very similar car, and it was super specific, and kind of saw the same thing unfold from different vantage points of the hotel. The other descriptions were vague and were like, "Oh, I saw a dark car drive away," or, I saw headlights in the distance. It never was anything concrete, but these 2 witnesses described a car that couldn't have been more different from the car that Toforest and his co-defendant were in that night. They were in a black Monte Carlo with a very loud muffler. And the witnesses in the hotel saw a vehicle that was copper or light brown with a maroon canvas, either T-tops or a convertible top. Which is very specific, and they did not report a loud muffler, which anyone that heard the car that Toforest was in said you could hear it coming down the street.
Probably not something you want to go use for a crime anyway.
Yeah, it just, there was nothing that signified anything like that. And then the person that they saw getting into the car didn't match Toforest's description and seemed to be alone. And Toforest was in the car with somebody else, and there were 2 teenage girls in the back seat. And so he had a whole group in his car, and this person that was in the parking lot, seen by the witnesses who heard the gunshots, seemed to be by himself, got in this copper or brown tan car and drove away slowly with the headlights off. The problem is, that description to me should have been the best bit of intelligence that these investigators were working off of, and they really disregarded it.
Wow. Yeah. So that's the witnesses in the hotel. And now you touched on it before, but who were witnesses for where Toforest was? Who provided the alibis for where Toforest was? I remember Club T and the kind of scene that you painted there. So
yeah, T's Place was the name of the club, and he was there with his friend Ardregas Ford, who also got charged in the crime, was also tried twice, but was acquitted. The jury found him not guilty. And the difference in the 2 of them is that Ardregas's family was able to raise money and hire a renowned criminal defense attorney. Toforest's family was not, and he had publicly appointed criminal defense that really did not do a thorough job. But they, at that night, went to T's Place, which was a really popular nightclub in the 90s. It was ladies' night. So, they went there to meet girls, and there were a lot of people there their age in their community that they saw. And they're people from different groups. It wasn't like, one group where they all got their story straight and decided to say this for Toforest. There was a young man in the nightclub that was a Marine who was home from boot camp or one of his tours, and Toforest hadn't seen him in years. And they talked at the club, and we ended up finding him and interviewing him. He wasn't connected with, the other groups of friends that Toforest saw that night. So that to me is very compelling when you have people from different parts of the city, different communities that are all kind of coming forward separately to say they saw Toforest. And he was with Ardregas, who was in a wheelchair. So it's very hard to mistake them for some other people. And then if you think about this narrative that the prosecution painted, that Toforest and Ardregas were at the hotel and committed the murder, one of the defendants is in a wheelchair. And so this is not like, an able-bodied person just hopping in their car and driving off. There's a lot more involved. And there was never any narrative to support that kind of scene.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like you and Mara did a better job than the investigators at the time finding people to speak to. It was really incredible how many different characters you had in the podcast, and some of them very explicitly and plainly explaining exactly what Toforest and Adregas were doing at the time at the club. Even the fact that, Adregas said he didn't have enough alcohol in his drink and they went back to the bar to reorder it. I mean, these are details that you just don't make up. They have to.
And that story of Toforest ended up, who hasn't had a weak drink and they wanted a little bit more from the bartender, but Toforest took his drink to the bar, got like another shot put in it. But that bartender, he told that story to police because they were asking him when they were interrogating him, who can vouch for you?
Right.
And he's, pulling up the names, which a lot of times were nicknames, but he's giving them names and he's saying, the bartender, I talked to him. He's like thinking back in his head, who all did I talk to at the club?
Right.
He's like, oh yeah, the bartender. We really looked for that bartender and wanted to find him, but we just couldn't. But that's an example of there was a whole list of people that these investigators could have and should have talked to clear these guys, and they just didn't. Or if they did, they didn't believe them.
Right. It's incredible. It's seriously incredible how far you have to go to not believe 10 people who all have their story matching. And so the police, they have the alibis of Toforest. They have the witnesses at the hotel that don't match. But eventually, they put a call out for any witnesses, I think, and they find somebody who maybe is able to give them some information that they failed to find themselves. And that person is Yolanda. Can you tell me a little bit about what makes Yolanda's story? Obviously, now in hindsight, we know that Yolanda was lying because she later came forward to say that she was lying. But can you tell me, even at the time, why it was so hard to trust Yolanda's story?
Well, Yolanda to me is just emblematic of how people can be exploited by our criminal justice system. And it's not always defendants or suspects. Oftentimes it's witnesses too, and it's young Black witnesses. And in this case, it was Black women.
Right.
Young Black women that were being pressured to rat somebody out or to say something that wasn't true. Yolanda was, by the time this case happened, already very troubled. She had a complex relationship with her mother, who was also troubled, who we go and interview for the series. But her mom and her were estranged at the time. And Yolanda was technically in state custody. She was supposed to be in like foster care, but she was essentially on the street, living, couch surfing, living with friends. Nobody was really keeping track of her. But her mother is the one that originally contacted police, and she already had a relationship with police, but she contacted them and said, I think my daughter has information about what happened. And they came and picked Yolanda up at her mother's urging. She was initially reluctant to talk to police, but eventually did. And then, went through, I think, 25 different police, contact visits. And she, had no lawyer with her. Her mom didn't go with her. She was by herself in a room with a bunch of detectives who, if you listen to the podcast, we're not exactly following best practices.
No.
Comes to interviewing any witness, let alone a juvenile.
Yeah.
So
can you talk a little bit about that, the pauses in the tapes and, what that could sort of signal?
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing, coming into this investigative file because there were over 50 hours of police interrogations, not just with Toforest and Ardragis, his co-defendant, but also many witnesses, including Yolanda. And it gave us such an incredible record to listen to hear kind of in real time how this thing went. I mean, at the beginning, they were so desperate. They were just pulling every Black person that was within like a mile and a half of the hotel into police custody and questioning them in such an overly aggressive, hostile way. It was enlightening, to listen to, really, as a white person, to listen to the way that Black people were treated and are treated in police custody. It was shocking. But what revealed itself to us in doing this audit and listening to all of this, having printed out transcripts and reading along and listening, is not exactly what they reveal and what they say, but what they reveal and what they don't say and when they stop the tape.
Yeah.
And it was such a head scratcher. The first time it happened, Mara and I are listening to the tapes and we're like, oh, that's so weird. They paused it and there's this long gap and then they come back on and it wasn't really clear how long they stopped it, but the story changed. And that is a feature of the whole investigation, not just with Yolanda, but with other witnesses as well. Them stopping and then restarting the tape, unclear why they stop it. We don't know what happens when the tape recorder is turned off. We do know that the lead investigator himself told me it's best practices to not do that.
Yeah, he actually says it.
Explain why he did it over and over again, but he was insistent that everything was above board.
Right. I thought that was such a funny part where he said, I don't remember why we stopped the tape, but I can tell you it was nothing sinister. It's like, I don't know how much I can trust that, sir. And, Yolanda later comes forward and says how much he was pressured by the police in, giving a somewhat of an account of the crime, and her story, like you said, changes. At one point she's not there and Ardragis just says that his friend shot a cop, and then next she's there and she actually sees it. And then the craziest part, like you've mentioned, is the blood dripping from Toforest's hand. I mean, it sounds like a soap opera.
Yeah.
We've seen police use these methods to get fake confessions from people time and time again. I'm sure a lot of people are aware of the Central Park 5 that's had a lot of coverage and stuff. And we actually saw those interrogations and just how violent they were and how pressurizing they were. I can't imagine. Then you ask the police investigator, and he says, oh, that hasn't happened since the 1800s. But
right.
From your coverage that this happens all the time.
Yeah, that interview with Detective Tony Richardson was really hard to do. We ended up talking to him on the record for 6 hours in 2 different interviews. And Mara and I kind of talked in advance. We really did want to meet him where he is and see where his head is at. But he was very defensive in the first interview, less so in the second interview, because I think he had some time to think about his answers and also think about the things that he said about Yolanda, which didn't age well, given, what ended up happening to her in life. We decided we were going to just meet him where he is. And what that meant was just letting him talk and listening to him talk, because he wouldn't stop talking and he kept saying all the quiet parts out loud. I did challenge him a number of times, kind of gently, because we wanted him to keep talking. We didn't want him to storm off. But it was hard. It was really hard to sit and listen to a lot of that. And there was a lot going on. I mean, you can tell when you are interviewing somebody and they're saying one thing, but there's an internal process that's happening kind of in conflict with what they're telling you. And I felt that with Jeff Wallace at times too, that he would walk all the way up to the line and then would sort of come back. But, in Jeff Wallace's defense, he didn't have to say anything at all about Toforest's case. And he has. And so I think that he does deserve credit for that. It's certainly not enough in many listeners' minds. But there's plenty of prosecutors, I think, that have taken regrets to the grave, and he's not doing that.
That's incredible. Yeah. And so at this point, the police literally only have Yolanda. She's this 50-year-old, quote unquote witness. Her story keeps changing. And later she comes forward. And what exactly does she say while she's on the stand?
So, which time? I mean, she's on the stand multiple times. The time that we found the most extraordinary was this pretrial hearing where the renowned defense attorney that Ardregas' family had hired filed a motion in court saying we really need to test her competency because she keeps changing. She changed who she said the killer was over and over again. There were originally 4 young Black men charged. And, each time she talked to police, she would change the choreography of the crime and who actually pulled the trigger. So finally, a hearing was held to test her competency. And that's where she raised her right hand and said, I have made all of this up. I wasn't there, but I did it because police pressured me and I was scared. They said that I could be a witness or a defendant, and being a defendant meant I was going to jail, and I didn't want to go to jail. So I told them what they wanted to hear, and it was confusing. And, I think that might have been the one time she told the truth. The judge did not allow her recantation to pause the prosecutions of Toforest and Ardregas. That's something that I don't understand. We hope to get some clarity from the judge, but he would not talk to us on the record, and he has since passed away. So we'll never know what went into his thinking. I mean, I think from a legal perspective, witnesses recant a lot in cases that are predicated on the word of a witness. And that oftentimes isn't enough if you've already gotten an indictment. It's not enough to stop a case from proceeding.
Oops. I think we've lost Beth.
Cases proceeded against Toforest and Ardregas, and Yolanda was no longer a witness in Toforest's case after that. She was a witness for the state against Ardregas, but the state relied on this second witness that they had against Toforest, who was Violet Ellison, the ear witness.
Yeah. So the namesake of your podcast, Ear Witness. And I guess before we get into Violet Ellison, can you just explain to me a little bit about how unreliable ear witnesses tend to be in general?
Yeah, I mean, we've heard a lot, in coverage of wrongful convictions about the unreliability of eyewitnesses. Ear witnesses are even more unreliable. There hasn't been as much study because they're so unreliable. There's not a lot of cases that are predicated on ear witnesses, especially capital murder cases. I think there's, I've heard of one other one in California. In fact, the defendant reached out to me after ear witness came out and said, hey, my case is really similar to Toforest. Will you take a look at it? I haven't had a chance to do that yet, but very few cases are based on the word of an ear witness. But it's essentially somebody who testifies about something they heard. And one of the biggest questions we got from Toforest community while we were making this is like, how is this not hearsay? This woman is claiming she heard something, but isn't that hearsay? And there's an exception to the hearsay rule. And if what you claim to have overheard involves the commission of a crime, that's the exception. And there was an argument in court that it was hearsay, but the judge granted the exception, and they were allowed to use her.
Wow. And what exactly does she say that she heard on that jail phone?
So that's another thing that's confusing about this story and why we felt like we needed to slow it down in a long form podcast. So Toforest was in the Jefferson County Jail because he'd been arrested for this crime based on Yolanda. And while he was in the jail, at the time in 1995, they didn't have, one of these jail phone systems. They literally had a phone booth.
Oh, wow.
And so the folks in the jail were allowed to keep quarters and had to use their own quarters to make phone calls outside the jail. Somebody on Toforest floor had figured out that if you call somebody and they make a three-way call, then you don't have to keep feeding quarters into the phone. And so the person that was making the three-way calls for this guy was the daughter of Violet Ellison, who is the ear witness. Her daughter was friends with one of the guys that was in jail at the time. And at one point he said, "Hey, can you make some calls for my friend Toforest?" And so what she would do would, they would call their home number, and the daughter would, get the number that they wanted to be connected to, connect the man to the phone, and then just put it down. She was essentially like a switchboard operator.
Yeah.
For the Jefferson County Jail, and her mother, Violet Ellison, did not like this. And so she had asked her to stop doing it. They had gotten into some arguments about it. And this was the pretext for Violet Ellison claiming that she picked up the phone and eavesdropped on one of these calls because she was concerned about her daughter. And she claimed it was a phone call between Toforest and a woman named Daisy, which is a phone call that he made. And we found Daisy, the other person on the line, in the making of the podcast, and people can hear from her about what actually was said, not what Violet Ellison claims was said. But that was the story that Violet Ellison brought to investigators after the reward money was announced. And another fact that is sort of lost in the milieu of this story is that she was a personal friend of the victim, had been closely following media coverage of the case, of which, all of it mentioned this reward money that was offered.
Right.
Every single news story that we saw mentioned the reward.
And probably the details of the case too, which helps her to form this, what she claims to have heard on the jail phone. I wish they could have recorded phone calls back then, because that would pretty much let Toforest free. It's such a shame. And I was going to ask you, and you kind of already mentioned it, what would be the motive for her to lie about overhearing this phone call?
Well, obviously it's financial. There was a lot of money on the table. I believe it was $20,000. That's a big reward. Violet is not a rich person. In fact, I would say she's poor, and she had major financial problems at the time. We also, in looking at her life, discovered that she had another motive, and that was getting preferential treatment for her own son, who was in and out of jail on all different kinds of charges, but never really getting, a really tough sentence. But he has a very long criminal record, and people who know her and the family say that that's always really been her primary focus, is looking out for her own son. So there's a lot of, I don't think there's like a smoking gun, but there are a lot of things happening at the same time. And the nature of her. I mean, she is apparently a meddlesome, nosy person who follows the news and inserts herself in a lot of people's affairs. She sort of sees herself as a neighborhood watch person unless it comes to her son. And then, she sort of looks the other way, or even, according to some family members, has lied to police about what her son is doing. So one of the folks we found that she has been entangled with said she's messy. She's a very messy lady. And, that is often not a credible witness.
Yeah.
So I think if we're going to predicate an entire capital murder case and try to execute somebody on a witness, we better make damn well sure this is somebody who's honest and wouldn't have any other reason to make up a story.
Right. And just to be clear, now that, everything rests on Violet Ellison and Yolanda is out of the picture and has been proven uncredible, is this the only piece of evidence that the police are relying on? There's nothing else that points to Toforest. Is that correct?
No, it is. I mean, Jeff Wallace himself told me she is the case.
Wow.
She is the entire case against Toforest Johnson. I think that is one thing that has kind of blown people's minds
Mm.
that aren't like you and me and don't spend like, 10 hours every day thinking
Right.
about these things. They're like, what? You can't send somebody to death row on that. And I'm like, oh, yes, you can. And they do. But I think that it's a good case to start questioning everything.
Yeah.
Not just this conviction, which it's clear, should be questioned and overturned.
Yeah.
But other convictions too. What are they relying on, and
Mm.
who? Why? It really throws the whole system into a different light.
Yeah, it's just incredible. I really couldn't believe it when I listened to the podcast, which was incredible again. I really just couldn't believe how much was resting on this one lady who got paid to say what she said,
She
or
got
at least
paid
was
to say
offered
what
to
she
be paid.
said,
Yeah,
and they didn't tell the jury that she
that's
was even
awesome.
paid. And
Yeah,
that's the part that I think really signals corruption,
yeah,
that, and that the current district attorney has had the hardest time with, is this is not above board.
yeah,
If you're going to use a paid witness, everybody has to know that it's a
right.
paid witness. And they didn't. And in
Yeah,
fact, the state hid it for 17 years.
that is just
Yeah.
disgusting. And
Yeah.
I guess the final sort of gaping hole that I see in this case, and if you have any extra like interesting points, I'd love to hear
Mhm.
them. But the final one is this like mutually exclusive sort of accounts of what happened during the crime that the prosecution try and put forward. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and why that's so kind of confusing?
Yeah, I mean, another sort of shocking feature of our criminal justice system and what prosecutors are allowed to do is they are allowed to try two different people for the same crime and present two mutually exclusive sets of facts and circumstances to two different juries as if they are staging a Broadway play.
Right.
And, that is allowed under the law. That is not illegal. It's not considered unethical, but like morally and like truthfully, how can you as a prosecuting attorney believe both stories?
Right.
That's the part that I can't square,
Right.
is they are supposed to believe. They are not supposed to present evidence that they know to be false. And so how does this being allowed square with that fact about their job?
Right.
And it doesn't. But that's exactly what they did in this case. They actually presented 5 different theories throughout proceedings, one to the grand jury, and then a different theory according to each trial, and there were 4. And one of the most rotten things I think the state did is, after Toforest was convicted and sentenced to death, they again tried Ardrakus. So they tried to send Ardragus to death row as well, using a different set of facts, using Yolanda Chambers as a witness who was discredited at Toforest trial by the state. They essentially called her a liar. And then months later, when they tried Ardragus, put her back on the stand and tried to convict him. He was acquitted.
Right.
So the jury didn't buy it, but it just kind of goes to show, the lengths that the state will go to get convictions, no matter how absurd the case is. Even if they've already gotten one death sentence, claiming one set of facts, they just could not stop themselves.
Right.
They were relentless, and it's shocking to hear it all laid out. Like, your reaction is what I've gotten from almost everyone who's listened to it, is they just cannot believe this is real.
I really can't believe this is real, even with all the work that, I've done in wrongful convictions across the US. This is one of the most blinding cases of injustice that I've ever seen. And just to like kind of put it in plain language. So the police know that there's one shooter.
Mhm.
And so if they manage to get Toforest on death row, and a Dragus on death row, which is what they wanted, they would know for a fact that at least one person was on death row who was innocent, and that's allowed.
Well, Jeff Wallace was reluctant to concede that the evidence showed that there was one shooter. I made the case to him. Your forensic expert testified that he died from the bullets that came out of one gun. And he said, well, that doesn't mean that there wasn't also another shooter there that maybe fired into the distance. I mean, it was, you know, he was reaching, but the short answer to your question is yes.
Wow.
You can't believe both stories.
Yeah. That's insane.
At the same time. Yeah.
That is absolutely insane. Do you think after, you know, going through Yolanda's uncredibility, Violet's, the witnesses at the hotel whose description of the shooter and the car don't match, the witnesses at the club that saw Toforest there and said, you know, there was no chance that he could have been both at the hotel and at the club. Is there anything else that really jumps out to you about this case that is just shocking in its, you know, invalidity?
I think that the hidden reward payment stunned me. That was kind of how I got into the case, was that issue was back in court in 2019. And I didn't know anything about Toforest case at the time. I wasn't living here when the murder happened, didn't follow the trials. I didn't know anything about it, but I was working in traditional media, and the assignment editor said, hey, there's this old death penalty case and it's going to be back in court. Maybe you want to go cover it. And I knew a little bit about the facts of the case. I knew his family and his attorneys were saying that he was innocent. And I knew that that could happen because I had covered Anthony Ray Hinton's exoneration in 2015, but I didn't know. I didn't know if Toforest did it or didn't do it. But when I sat through that 5-hour hearing and heard the facts laid out and then understood that, wow, the only evidence is this woman's testimony, and she testified in the hearing. And the state is basically admitting it paid her and then didn't disclose the payment for 17 years. This is messed up. And so that was sort of the thing that interested me at first. And then I got to know Toforest's family and I read the trial transcripts and I was like, like mind exploding. And I just knew that it would make for a riveting podcast because of all the twists and turns and all the different issues happening at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And one of the hard things about the podcast was, of course, it was, you know, by no fault of your own, missing Toforest because of Alabama rules around, you know, interviewing incarcerated people. But from your conversations with Toforest, like, I guess if you could just give me a little bit of like who he is as what's his kind of like character like?
Yeah, his family stays in regular contact with him, and I'm in contact with them. And so I know that he's very funny. He stays very positive. He's very close to his mother and his kids and grandkids. He has 19 grandkids. Basically, you know, the relationships are based over the phone and through the mail. They do go down and visit him, you know, when they can, but it's a long drive. Holman Prison is in Atmore, Alabama, which is like at the edge of the state.
Yeah.
You know, as hell on earth is what, you know, some people call it. But he's really an incredible person. I mean, the fact that he is able to stay positive and maintain a sense of humor really just says so much about him and his like grit and constitution as a human, because I think I would have gone insane by now. But I think that from what I know, he gets his strength from his faith and he gets his strength from his family, and he feels a real responsibility to stay strong for them. And so they all are such a beautiful, wonderful family that has so much love for each other. It's just been such a privilege to get to know them. And it has been so inspiring to see how they all kind of hold each other up, and he holds them together. His attorneys have told me, you know, that he oftentimes on attorney calls is like the most positive voice,
Oh,
in the conversation. And it's just the way that he is. And so I think that's probably saved him, the fact that that's just his personality and he's not a negative person. I think he also really wants to get home to his family, and he's getting older.
yeah,
He spent
yeah.
more time on death row now than he spent as a free person. So
Mm.
it's beyond time for him to get to come home.
Absolutely, yeah, and unfortunately, you'll never get back those 26 years, even when hopefully it is proven that he didn't commit this crime and he wasn't even there.
Yeah.
And I guess if you could just let me know, like, what's next for Toforest? Like, are we in the process of any appeals or hearings that he's waiting on?
He does not have any hearings scheduled, but he does have an appeal in Jefferson County Court in front of a new judge,
Oh, great.
which is hopeful. And it sort of rests there. I mean, that's how these cases go. There's a lot of waiting, and so, but I think that there's a lot of hope that there's been a change on the court.
Yeah,
And so sometimes that is what a case needs,
definitely.
is a new set of ears and eyes on it. So that's where it is. A lot of people will say, how much time does he have left? And, death penalty post-conviction work doesn't really work like that, but he does have more than this appeal that has to see its way through the court. So he has some time, not much.
Right.
Even like a few years on death row is not much time. So I would say that's where he is. But he's just, like you said, spent far too much time there already.
Yeah.
But is hopeful.
Yes, yes. And thanks probably in part to your work, which is raising, awareness for his case and just how unfair and unjust the conviction is. If people are watching and listen to your podcast, which again, Ear Witness on Apple Podcasts, it's incredible, seriously. If they want to help other than listening to the podcast and, learning about his case, what can they do?
Yeah, there's a advocacy campaign that Greater Birmingham Ministries has set up for Toforest, and it's all on his website, toforestjohnson.com. And I think there's a get involved button or sign up how you can help. And there's like a number of different things that are happening. There's events. There is a banner tour. There's a big banner that says it's not too late to fix this mistake. And there's a QR code that takes you to the website, but it has traveled across Alabama and has been hosted by churches.
Wow.
And so the faith community has really come together, and dozens of churches have gotten involved. They've hosted listening events. There's been prayer events. There was a billboard in Birmingham where there was like a prayer walk that went with it. So people that sign up on this website can know about different events, and they're not always in Alabama. Sometimes there's events in other parts of the country. And so that's really, I think, the best way for people to get involved.
That's amazing. Seriously amazing. And again, thank you for all the work that you've done on this case and continue to do to expose the injustices in our criminal justice system. I'm sure oftentimes it's a thankless job, but it is making a real difference, and hopefully more and more people will know about Forrest's case and can kind of ring the alarm about the injustices in it. So thank you again, Beth. And
yeah, thank you so much, Gabby. Thank you for your interest, and for everybody that logged on. I see the list of names. So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for caring and for being here to listen in.
Yes. And again, Ear Witness is the podcast that Beth Shelburne made about this case with her producer, Mara. It's available on Apple Podcasts, and it takes you along this whole case in a beautiful narrative journey that is highly entertaining for the wrong reasons, but will keep you hooked on the podcast. So thank you again, Beth. And I hope we can talk under happier circumstances next time when Toforest is proven innocent.
Sounds good. Yeah.
Okay. Take care.
You too.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching. Bye. Thank you, everyone. So much for watching. I'm trying to end this live, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Thank you. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Isaac. Thanks, Doubting Thomas. Thank you both. Thank you all so much for watching. These cases happen all the time, and it's just heartbreaking. All right, take care. Have a lovely rest of your week.